How do we create doctrinal and cultural changes to support mission command? We look at the people, products, and the processes required for an effective command function. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second part of our interview with retired Lieutenant Colonel Jim Storr. He is the author of a very important book, I believe, Something Rotten, Land Command in the 21st Century. In the last episode, we were looking at issues with the current processes for decision-making and the generating and promulgation of orders. Let's continue on with that discussion now. When you look at those processes, where do you see excellence? Which headquarters, which generals, which processes do you think are the ones that we should be looking to for inspiration and examples of how it should be done?
The small ones. And I don't mean the small generals. There's an interesting one there about, well, yes, the risk of a gender-biased assessment, small man syndrome. And there is this great joke that Napoleon was quite short. I don't think he was, actually. There's the evidence that he was about the same height, I think, as the Duke of Wellington. That's neither here nor there. No, but small headquarters. But I think that's a symptom, not the underlying thing. And again, here's another thing. The moment that you mention the Germans in the Second World War, there is a kind of academic or a kind of officer out there saying, oh, but they were vicious Nazi thugs. Well, some of them were. Oh, but they lost the Second World War. Well, actually, think about it. Strategic disaster. I mean, at the strategic level, that war should never happen, and Hitler was almost bound to lose at the strategic level. And when you get, just open any book on any operation after, let's say, 1942, when you get Hitler interfering down, certainly to divisional level, and probably down, in some cases, down to regimental level, you cannot run a war that way. Now, you should take that aside and says, was basically the German army good at doing that stuff? Whatever its other failings were, yes, it was. What's more to the point, several people writing at the time or writing in the 70s looking back said, yes, we knew that. We knew the Germans were better than us, faster than us, those kind of things. So I think you have to strip away some of this whole thing about the Wehrmacht. Yeah, there was a lot of bad things, but there were some things that they did which we knew at the time, the Western Allies knew at the time, were just streets better than what we were doing.
Looking at that, you've mentioned in the book some of the, almost term them, the HR practices that they had within the Wehrmacht, particularly around identifying staff and then the training that those highlighted staff received. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, about the way that they picked their officers and groomed them for command?
Yeah, I could say quite a lot about that, but it's probably better to be slightly more generalized. In other words, pick out the best of American, British, German practice pre-war, and how that was carried forward. In round terms, when you look at the guys who come out of, who were in command at the end of the Second World War, in most armies, they are not brash, they are not extrovert, they are incredibly professional, they are very, very capable, they are mostly people who've been picked up quite young and promoted in the field. But you then have to go back a generation before that and say, okay, so how, for example, did the British and Commonwealth armies or the American armies or the Wehrmacht train for that, and who were they? First thing to say is that practically every army had at least 2 years, and in some cases 3 years, for their best officers at staff colleges. The numbers involved were small. If you take the sort of numbers that would come to me from the tail end of the Cold War, which admittedly is jumping forward, about 10%. All the officers that went to military academy 12, 15 years later would go to staff college. And of those, of the original, so 10% go to staff college, 1 or perhaps 2% would be the brigade majors, chiefs of staff, those the divisional planners, those kind of things. So there has been a selection process of 12, 15 years. Now, once you've got to that, once you're in those 1 or 2%, the chance of you getting through to certainly full colonel, probably brigadier, quite possibly higher, was very, very good indeed. Now, what were you looking at? some of it fell back onto social stereotypes. And I think, for example, if you look at the narrow social conditions of the British Army in the Rhine, we fell victim of that. But if you just go back a little bit before that and you say, okay, so the end of 6 years of war, who are we looking for? They had identified the guys who were seriously good, and they kept them in the system right through until that cohort, that cadre ran out, probably in the 1970s, in some cases in the 1980s. And a really good example, I can't remember his name, but the engineer commander of Guards Armed Division. So think about this. He's not a guardsman, he can't be because he's a sapper. But the Army, and particularly the Corps of Royal Engineers, has picked this guy as being, first of all, has to be very, very competent because he's going to be the engineer commander for an armoured division. But secondly, he has to have the interpersonal skills to get on with the guards and all their various sort of social niceties and this, that and the other. And you go, well, why does Jim pick on those? And the reason why I pick it is I am fairly certain that since the Second World War and right through to Sir Peter Wall in the 20noughties, he was the only sapper to be Chief of the General Staff. I pick not him necessarily as the epitome, but illustrative of the fact that the people who had actually come through the Second World War had been noted by their peers as being very, very capable, and they stood on a generation going back that had been trained for the best part 2, sometimes 3 years. And they'd been selected through that process largely on their competence. But that's quite a long answer. You probably want to come back to me on that because I'm not quite sure that I've answered your question well.
No, I think that's really good. It's looking at the way that we probably could do better. Because at the moment, there's a lot of people who make full colonel, and you talk about the proliferation of stars and the ratio of senior officers to junior officers. And it's very different to what it was in World War II. And all of those people have to have a job, I guess.
Well, that's it. And what I notice, and I can't really prove it because I'm not an expert in the G1 and the military secretary kind of world, is that we're now getting people appointed to be colonels and brigadiers who haven't really commanded anything substantive. Now, there was always going to be one of those. I mean, some of those. For example, the guy who commanded your education and training service needed to be an education and training bloke, and we used to be the Royal Army Educational Corps, and he was never going to command anything. Well, that's not really what I'm getting to. But when you're getting to like generalists who have not commanded battalions, battle groups, getting through to brigadier, you go, or brigadier general, you go, why are we doing this? Have we not got too many of them? Now, there's a downside that people say that, yeah, but actually, if we only pick the guys who have done that, then the selection pool is too narrow. Well, I'd say you're thinking about this the wrong way round. The best have got there, by and large, because they are the best, and you should be selecting from there. And occasionally you'll get an exception. Well, most armies, even ones that aren't particularly large in peacetime, can manage exceptions, but then you'll find that their experience runs out somewhere because they haven't done those jobs on the way up or whatever.
Looking through the book, there's multiple references to a couple of key texts. One is Truppenführung, which was written before the Second World War, the German manual, and then Staff Officers' Duties in the Field, 1949, I think is the distillation of wisdom from 6 years of combat in the British Army. How much difference is there between the two texts?
Well, those things do two very, very different things. Truppenführung is effectively the overall tactical and operational doctrine to the Wehrmacht. And interestingly, they just never, ever revised it. So I think you're right. I think it's the 1936 or 1936 and 37. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, they just went to war with it and they just never revised it, which I think they probably could have done. In other words, if they were to write it again from fresh in 1944, it would look quite different. But that's another point. I think that tells you that the Wehrmacht were not that concerned about the written word. They were far more concerned with what it was that actually got real generals in the real world to win real battles. I think the focus was not on written doctrine. I think that is a problem. Please come back to me on that one later if you want to. But the other thing is that staff duties in the field is precisely that. It is a staff work manual. So staff duties in the field does not pretend to, if you like, lay out a theory of war or great tactical and operational tenets. You just have to do that sort of thing. But I think one of the points that you're getting to is the fact that it is very small. It's what we would now call an A6 booklet. And I shock people in the British Army here quite frequently because our junior officers are taught a thing called the 7 questions, which are 76 pages of an A4 thing called the Planning and Execution Handbook. The only equivalent to that is 2.5 pages in staff duties in the field, literally 2.5 pages. And one of my colleagues over the weekend did point out that the Tactical Aide Memoire doesn't have 76 pages of A4. It's only got, I think, about 8 pages of A6. Yeah, but the real point was back in 1949 we only had the 2.5 pages, not the 76 pages and the 8-page précis. So I think it's telling you that it is entirely possible to wage wars with very, very little explicit process. It's not to say a lot of work wasn't done, and I think a really, really good example of that is the Normandy landings. The initiating directive is tiny, effectively 5 sides. There is then a huge amount of staff work done. I mean, can you imagine what it takes to get, I think it's 77,000 soldiers, a few airmen, a few sailors, ashore, with their kit on one day on a defended beach, and get it substantially right? I mean, a huge amount of work, but the process behind that, the how do you do staff work, was effectively a couple of pages in the tiny little handbook. So the emphasis was actually on doing it, not following the process. And I think that says a lot about the whole debate at the moment.
When you mentioned doctrine, for those without, and I think you mentioned it being sort of the handrails, and particularly for officers who aren't experienced, that's the reflex action. Let's pull out the doctrine and run with that. Because if you're following doctrine, you can't really go too wrong, you would think. But if the doctrine's not the best doctrine that it could be, then you probably can go very wrong, particularly if you've got the 7 questions, we've got the military appreciation process. How do we affect change at the doctrinal level? Because this is where it really needs to be at, isn't it?
Well, yes, no. I mean, I've been saddened recently to hear really quite senior people saying, oh, such and such is now in the doctrine. In other words, the first thing you should do is rely on the doctrine. And the doctrine that they're referring to is an explicit process. Cut most of it down, because what you're really asking someone to do is go and refer to the doctrine and do what it says. But they'll say, oh, we've got mission command. No, you haven't. Let's get doctrine right down to a framework of, effectively, Operation X, let's say, a battalion assault river crossing or a divisional attack against a defended position, should look like this. These are the major steps. What we now want you to do, if in that case your division, is to go and rehearse and practice that. We want you to make yourself familiar with how you, Division X, will do that. And the really good example to my mind that comes out of that is Mattis and his Marine Division in Iraq in 2003. What they could have done is try and work out which river, which regiment would cross on which day of a multiple-day operation. They didn't. What they did was come up with building blocks whereby, okay, we will get all of our regiments to go through this as command post exercises, as map and model exercises, call them what you will. We get one of the regiments to do it for real. It happened to be the Colorado River. But what it meant was, on day, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, so it wasn't actually day 3, it was day 5, and it wasn't actually the river they thought it was a different, and so on and so forth. But the regiment involved could just go, we know how to do this, and they did so very, very, very quickly. So the reason why they could do that was not because there was great doctrine in the Marine Corps, whatever it is, about assault river crossings, but because that regiment was familiar, and its battalions were familiar with what it took to get a regiment to cross a river, in broad terms, and they could adapt that to the particular river, the particular day, or was it the particular night that they found themselves on. Now, If you look at what our fathers and grandfathers were doing in the Second World War, yeah, you're pretty well right there. And another good example, sorry, you're about to say, James?
Oh, no, I was just thinking back to Guderian and the crossing of the Meuse River, which I think they almost used the same set of orders for a training exercise that they'd conducted a couple of months earlier.
Yeah, there's a copy over there. I could actually put my finger on which annex, but it actually says in the annex, obviously translated from German to English, and Guderian, when he was writing that book, had copies of the orders. In other words, they're basically, let's call it facsimiles. It says, refer to Meuse exercise. Now, let's be sensible about this. In the case of Guderian and the Meuse and Sedan 1940, he knew that at some stage his corps would have to do the Meuse at Sedan. Sorry, Moselle, not. He referred to the Moselle example, right? So he could reasonably do what we might call a rehearsal. But even then, it was a number of months. I think it was February through to May, from one to the other. If you take, say, for example, a field engineer company, 21st Army Group, breaking out of the Normandy lodgement area, August into September of 1944, there's one of them that did, I think I'm right in saying, 5 river crossings, 5 night bridging operations in 7 successive days. It's something like that. They couldn't conceivably rehearse for that England beforehand. But what they could do is do several night assault bridging operations on rivers somewhere in England so that the guys knew broadly how the company commander would do it when it came to a couple of months from here. So rehearsals can do an awful lot, but we're not necessarily, and this is the point where I think people fall over themselves, they try to rehearse for the specific rather than rehearse for the generic. And I think the difference is important, but what you then need to do is have wise commanders who can say, this is how we adapt the generic to this river tonight, or whatever it happens to be.
Part of the reason for extensive orders and a whole alphabet of annexes is the drive for synchronization. Do you think that synchronization has become more complex than it was in World War II? And where do we go if we do cut down orders? How do we manage to synchronize effects?
Right, synchronization is a wonderful piece of military sociology gone wrong. I am very confident, if not certain, that the problem arises from the fact that the American staff system did not teach execution. I don't think it still does. There's a little bit of it. But in round terms, right up to and including the 1980s, American staff officers, and therefore the next generation commanders, were not taught the execution. Come back to how we teach that later. But the result was, when they started doing large exercises on their collective training areas, they found that they couldn't, and I'm using the word carefully, coordinate the actions of their superiors. And if you look at the doctrine coming out of air-land battle and those kind of things, and that sort of period, so you're talking late 70s into the 80s, they start coming up with words coordination, words synchronization. And to my mind, they get it wrong. They then get into, and please, it's in the book, but also you can follow it down, which is what I did through the American manuals, where they started imposing top-down synchronization. In simple round terms, synchronization matrix anathema, an accursed thing. It should be entirely unnecessary, but I can hear generations of people out there going, Storr doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the one thing we need. Well, I get into a long discussion here and now, but no, it isn't. It is hugely important. It's critical that the relevant military activities are coordinated in time, space, and purpose. The way that other armies used to do things during the Cold War was coordination between peers, sideways. And that was mostly achieved by things like cloth model and sand table exercises, so that people knew and talked through beforehand how they would do things, so that when they went to do them on FTXs, they broadly knew, and you didn't need synchronization matrices. So, an awful lot of the answer to your question is no, synchronization has not become more complex. It was always very important. It was always highly necessarily and needed to be done, but there are better ways of doing it than imposed top-down synchronization. And underpinning a lot of what we've been saying during today, top-down coordination, first of all, tends to go wrong. Secondly, places subordinates at a disadvantage because they need to try and patch it up and make it work when it does go wrong. Thirdly, gives the army the advantage because all of a sudden your own plan is letting you down. But fourthly, should be totally unnecessary. Trust the guys nearer to the front end to do things between them. Practice them in doing that. They will do. And to quote George C. Patton III, they will surprise you with the results.
Yes. The things that we've talked about, the process, the systems, people selection, they all have a significant impact on culture. And militaries have quite strong cultures. And I think we're almost getting to the point where it's feeding back on itself now, and we're getting further and further away from where we need to be because the culture is driving processes that get bigger. How do we short-circuit that? How do we really start to bring it back to where we need to be, where mission command is enabled and required?
Culture is a difficult problem. We could go on forever about it. I think from what I've been recently, there's too much talk of culture and not enough talk of basic human behaviours, which is probably irrelevant for the moment. But what I observe looking through centuries, but certainly the 20th century, as the subject of one of my books is, that Western armies are incredibly pragmatic. That is to say, when they see that things don't work, they fix them, which is absolutely great. But in the absence of evidence, they have no reason to fix things. I am reasonably confident that if we got into a major scrap against somebody, we would find that a lot of what we're doing is going wrong. And therefore, what our commanders quite rightly would do is sling a lot of it out, go back to the basics that they are confident that does work. And when they find that those things work, they would reinforce those things. Part of the problem now, I think, is that people don't really have a feeling for what those things are. And so we're falling into other things when we mentioned earlier, things like risk assessment and matrices and all that kind of things. Let's try and come up with a training system by which they can see the sort of things that are likely to work in war. Not, for example, wonderfully, highly synchronized main events lists where everybody had to take their turn to execute the wonderfully planned multiple stage, multiple phase, blah, blah, blah. Let's have the one where, embarrassingly, enemy motor rifle regiment breaks through 3 UK div using the road that they didn't find on the exercise and embarrasses the staff and the divisional commander. Ouch, we'll get that better next time. A few of those, I think, realistic. No one's saying that we should have the situation where Red Force are Supermen. But when we have that and a tolerance of learning from those kind of CPX failures, I think we would start being a lot more effective in what we were doing.
Yeah, I think you've just answered my last question, because I think losing a war gives a great incentive to look at really what works and what doesn't. And we see significant improvement in Germany and indeed the defeats of Jena and Auerstadt, which led to the Prussian general staff system. Then after World War I, the question in my mind is, because we probably can't afford to lose the next big show, and we don't want to. I know looking at World War II, there was a lot that had been forgotten after World War I on the Allied side, and there was a lot of. It took a couple of years for many of the armies to get up to speed to be able to operate effectively. So yes, you've spoken about the ways that we can sort of get ahead of the curve so that we don't need to spend 2 years losing battles around the world. Is there anything else that you'd want to add to that?
No, I think it's largely true. The other thing is we shouldn't be too harsh on our grandfathers. British, Commonwealth, American armies of 1939, 1940 were not bad. They weren't good, but they were not bad if the enemy had been the Imperial Army of 1918. They weren't as good as they should have been. They had forgotten some things, but they got some things moderately right. The thing that sets, to my mind, the Germans apart in that regard was that they had thought in more detail about it. I could actually, if you like, come up with a new play on the chessboard. And when they did that, we were floundering because we just weren't expecting it at all. But the key thing, if you think about the Germans, is not necessarily armour. Everybody had tanks. Not necessarily coordination with artillery. Most people could do that to an extent. The key thing that they had given themselves in 39, 40, 41 was speed. Now, I don't think that was new to the German army. I think going back to Jena and Auerstadt, learned that a long, long time before. But they set about effectively gaining themselves, creating for themselves speed. And I think if you're going to look for a bottom line, you look at Ukraine and the way it's being fought and all the rest of it. If an army could do the basic things at speed, the other army would fall over badly. You can get into an awful lot of Ukraine, and that's not the subject of this talk, I realise that. But I think that there's nothing particularly shocking or surprising about coming out of Ukraine, to my mind.
It would have been predictable if you'd actually tried to predict it. We often plan to fight the wars that we want to fight, not the wars that are thrust upon us.
Yeah, I think that's largely true.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I think it's really valuable, and I think it's a really important book, and everyone should be reading it because it's full of really interesting examples, which I think everyone can sort of see what it is that we're doing wrong.
Well, that's very kind of you, James, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Colonel Storr for being very generous with his time and his expertise in this. I am a firm believer that everyone who is likely to post into a headquarters role should be reading Something Rotten so that everyone has a much better idea about what right looks like. After the interview, I was reflecting, if we are wargaming, we're often being red-teamed by a headquarters that is using our procedures to make decisions and to get those orders out. So it's very difficult for us to get an understanding of if we are doing things in a timely manner. It's only when we're involved in high-intensity combat with a significant manoeuvre component to it that we'll be able to determine whether orders are being generated in a timely manner. If we were to face an enemy that was capable of producing orders in the kind of timeframes that Colonel Storr was talking about, for corps, divisional, brigade, battalion level orders, we will find ourselves significantly wanting. And that's why this book is so important. That's all for this week. As always, if you've got anything out of today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast player, or retweet or share one of our Facebook posts. It really helps us get the word out there. We're just shy of 700,000 downloads for the podcast series, which is not too bad for a professional military education podcast.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.